Archibald Gracie watched Carpathia's slow approach to the rescue.
It was at quite an early stage that I had seen far in the distance the unmistakable mast lights of a steamer about 4 or 5 points away on the port side. My eyes were fixed for hours that night on the lights of that steamer far away in the distance, which afterwards proved to be those of the Carpathia. To my great disappointment, they seemed to make no progress towards our rescue. This, we were told later, was due to meeting an iceberg as she was proceeding full speed toward the scene of the Titanic's wreck. She had come to a stop in sight of the lights of our lifeboats, or such as had them. Finally, dawn appeared, and there on the port side of our upset boat, where we had been looking with anxious eyes, glory be to God, we saw the steamer Carpathia about 4 or 5 miles away, with other Titanic lifeboats rowing towards her. First-class passenger, Archibald Gracie.
Thayer failed in his attempt to relieve a distraught Bruce Ismay.
Because I had known Ismay so well on board the Titanic, the doctor of the Carpathia, the afternoon that we approached New York, asked me if I would not visit Mr. Ismay in his cabin and talk to him, to see if I could not help relieve the terribly nervous condition he was in. I immediately went down, and as there was no answer to my knock, I went right in. He was seated in his pajamas on his bunk, staring straight ahead, shaking all over like a leaf. My entrance apparently did not dawn on his consciousness. Even when I spoke to him and tried to engage him in conversation, telling him that he had a perfect right to take the last boat, he paid absolutely no attention and continued to look ahead with his fixed stare. I am almost certain that on the Titanic his hair had been black with slight tinges of gray, but now his hair was virtually snow white. I have never seen a man so completely wrecked. Nothing I could do or say brought any response. As I closed the door, he was still looking fixedly ahead. First-class passenger, Jack Thayer.
In spite of his injuries, Harold Bride went back to work as soon as possible.
I guess I lay in the hospital until near night, when they told me the Carpathia's wireless man was acting queer, and would I help. After that, I was never out of the wireless room. Marconi wireless operator, Harold Bride.
After having told reporters that Titanic was unsinkable, White Star President Phillip Franklin was forced to tell them that she had sunk.
Immediately when that telegram was received by me, it was such a terrible shock that it took us a few minutes to get ourselves together. Then at once I telephoned myself to 2 of our directors, Mr. Steele and Mr. Morgan, Jr., and at the same time sent downstairs to the reporters. I got off the first line and a half where it said, "The Titanic sank at 2:00 a.m." And there was not a reporter left in the room. They were so anxious to get out and telephone the news. White Star Line Vice President Phillip Franklin.
Like so many Southampton children, Dorothy Cross grew up hearing stories of the Titanic.
My grandmother was a headmistress at Grove Street School. I remember the story my mother told. She was visiting my grandmother and they went into this one class and grandmother said, "Stand up, any child who has a relative on the Titanic," and the whole class stood up. And one little mite said, "Oh, there's no need to worry, miss, the Olympic is rushing to her aid." And I thought that's the trust of a child, isn't it? You know. Southampton resident Dorothy Cross.
Francis Dyke, working aboard the Minia, wrote to his mother about finding bodies.
We began the search yesterday, and the first we picked up was C.M. Hayes of Grand Trunk Rail. It was no trouble to identify him, as he had a lot of papers on him, and a watch with his name. We picked up 10 more bodies yesterday, waiters and sailors. All those who are identified are embalmed and packed in ice and are to be sent to New York. I can tell you none of us like this job at all, but it is better to recover them and bury them properly than let them float about for weeks. The Reverend Cunningham came out with us to bury those not identified. When we passed over the spot where the Titanic sank, he held a short service in the saloon, which I thought to be very nice of him. I expected to see the poor creatures very disfigured, but they all look as calm as if they were asleep. Many a seaman, Francis Dyke.
Mrs. Johanna Stunke, a first-class passenger on the North German Lloyd liner Bremen, sailed past a fateful iceberg on April 20th, 1 week after the disaster.
It was between 4 and 5 o'clock on Saturday when our ship sighted off to bow to the starboard an iceberg. As we drew nearer and could make out small dots floating around in the sea, a feeling of awe and sadness crept over everyone, and the ship proceeded in absolute silence. Looking down over the rail, we distinctly saw a number of bodies so clearly that we could make out what they were wearing and whether they were men or women. We saw one woman in her nightdress, with a baby clasped closely to her breast. Several of the women passengers screamed and left the rail in a fainting condition. There was another woman, fully dressed, with her arms tight around the body of a shaggy dog that looked like a Saint Bernard. The bodies of 3 men in a group, all clinging to one steamer chair, floated close by, and just beyond them were a dozen bodies of men, all in life preservers, clinging together as though in the last desperate struggle for life. Those were the only bodies we passed near enough to distinguish, but we could see the white life preservers of many more, dotting the sea all the way to the iceberg. Bremen first-class passenger Johanna Stunke.
Lightoller explains how testifying in the British investigation was a bit trickier than in the American inquiry.
In Washington, it was of little consequence, but in London it was very necessary to keep one's hands on the whitewash brush. Sharp questions that needed careful answers if one was to avoid a pitfall, carefully and subtly dug, leading to a pinning down of blame onto someone's luckless shoulders. How hard Mr. Scanlon and the legal luminary representing the interests of the seamen and firemen tried to prove there were not enough seamen to launch and man the boats. The same applied to the passengers, and quite truly, but it was inadvisable to admit it then and there, hence the hard-fought verbal duels between us. Mr. Scanlon's aim was to force the admission that I had not sufficient seamen to give adequate help with the boats, and consequently that the ship was undermanned. Second Officer Charles Lightoller.